Another setback for the Iran nuclear deal. Tehran disconnects cameras surveilling its nuclear sites. The United Nations says it is a fatal blow to the accord. Can the landmark agreement be salvaged? I'm Jafar Hasnan, and today's newsmaker is the Iran nuclear deal. Donald Trump pulled out from it. Joe Biden said he wanted to revive it. But after 7 years, is the Iranian nuclear deal on the verge of complete collapse? After the government in Tehran switched off more than 24 surveillance cameras in its nuclear facilities, Rafael Grossi, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, said this.
What we are seeing is because of the decision that is been announced to us today, is a decrease of the visibility that the agency is going to have about what's happening in Iran. And of course, this is something I deplore.
So the JCPOA is dead if it's not done within the next 4 weeks?
I think this would be a fatal blow.
But according to Iran, the decision to disconnect 27 cameras was in response to action by the IAEA. The UN nuclear watchdog censured Tehran, saying it was failing to cooperate over its nuclear program. It came after the Vienna-based body raised concerns after finding traces of enriched uranium at 3 sites that were not supposed to be conducting nuclear activities. But Foreign Ministry spokesperson Saeed Khatibzadeh took to Twitter with a criticism of his own.
The US E3 put their short-sighted agenda ahead of the IAEA's credibility by pushing a miscalculated and ill-advised resolution against a country with the world's most transparent, peaceful nuclear program. The initiators are responsible for the consequences. Iran's response is firm and proportionate.
That's the government's take, but inside Iran, some are calling for more cooperation.
It is better for Iran to agree to these resolutions in order to prevent more wars, to establish world peace and to avoid an increase of sanctions, because these sanctions and the high cost of living are putting a lot of pressure on the people.
I think it is better to cooperate more, so that a global consensus is not formed against us.
We call on the authorities to cooperate more so that the problems do not get worse and people can live in prosperity and peace.
When the landmark deal was first signed in 2015, there were celebrations, but over the past few years, it has certainly had its ups and downs. Let's take a look.
On April 2nd, 2015, history is made. China, France, Russia, the UK, US and Germany reach a landmark nuclear deal with Iran. The accord, which restricts Iran's nuclear activities in return for easing sanctions, comes into force at the start of 2016. But 2 years later, the deal is dealt a massive blow. US President Donald Trump withdraws from the accord and embraces a maximum pressure policy against Iran.
The fact is, this was a horrible, one-sided deal that should have never, ever been made. It didn't bring calm, it didn't bring peace, and it never will.
Another setback in January 2020. The US assassinates top Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. Tehran responds in a tit-for-tat battle, abandoning all JCPOA commitments. In November the same year, Iranian nuclear scientist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh is also killed. Iran blames Israel for the murder. 2 months later, Tehran begins to enrich uranium to 20%, further exceeding the JCPOA's limit of just over 3.5%. After Trump is defeated, the new US President Joe Biden tries to revive the deal. In April 2021, high-level talks kick off in Vienna. Washington attends the meeting, but indirectly. Over 11 months, delegates meet 8 times. The final round of talks were held in February this year. But 4 months later, Iran disconnects 27 cameras surveying its nuclear facilities in response to being censured by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Its chief calls it a fatal blow to the deal.
And joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Patrick Clausen. He's the Director of Research at the Washington Institute, where he directs the Vertibi program on Iran and U.S. policy. From Isfahan in Iran is political analyst and researcher Setareh Sadeghi. And from Paris, we have Borzou Daraghi, an international correspondent at The Independent and a senior fellow at the Scowcroft Center. Thank you very much all for joining us today here on the Newsmakers. Patrick, let me begin with you. With all the developments that we have seen in recent weeks, the IAEA censuring Iran and Iran dismantling surveillance cameras at nuclear sites. Tell me, how big of a blow is this to the JCPOA? Can it still be salvaged?
Probably not. That is to say, the two sides have dug in their positions very firmly about the issues which remain to be resolved, primarily the question of whether or not to designate the Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organization. And each side seems determined not to move very far.
Okay, Setareh, does Iran share the same view? Is it highly unlikely for the JCPOA to be revived?
That's what it seems to be like with the U.S. Unilateral withdrawal from the deal, and then European partners of the deal failing to cooperate with Iran and together to revive the deal, and then Iran making decisions to reduce its commitments. It doesn't seem that there's much chance left to revive the deal at this point.
Okay, Borzou, let me get your thoughts on this as well.
I mean, the problem is that, yeah, both of those speakers, Patrick and Setareh, are both right. It's a grim situation. The problem is that for neither of the countries, is there really a viable plan B? I think if the U.S. actually believes that it's going to go back to 2011, when Medvedev was president of Russia and China was in a lot less of a bellicose mood, and get that coalition together to put pressure on Iran, it is sorely mistaken. And I think that Iran's calculation that it can just sort of rely on Russia and China and the Eurasian continent for economic and technological support is also mistaken. China and Russia will throw Iran under a bus in a second if the West offers them a better deal. So I think that is really where the discussion should be focused, at least as far as analysts, is what comes after the JCPOA. Nothing good for anyone.
Okay, so as I understand, all of you share the same view that it's highly unlikely for the Iran nuclear deal to be salvaged, but that's not what the Director General of the IAEA thinks. He thinks there's still a small, even though a very, very small, but there's still a window of opportunity. Patrick, do you think stakeholders are going to make use of that window of opportunity to try to save the deal?
It's possible. To be fair, Supreme Leader Khamenei has not come out with a definitive wording criticizing the deal, so it's possible that he would agree to some compromise solution. A number of ideas have been floated. So far, there doesn't seem to be any way to reach the differences between the two. And as Mr. Grossi indicated, the loss of these cameras becomes a problem only in about a month. But I don't think there's much chance that we're going to see movement in that month. It could happen. Won't rule it out. But Grossi's being very optimistic. That's what he's like as a person. He's always an optimist. I hope he's right.
I mean, you mentioned the Supreme Leader Khamenei there. Do you think he's the one who decides what happens next when it comes to the JCPOA? Or would you say it's other stakeholders such as the United States?
Well, the Supreme Leader has a major say on these questions, and we'll have to see where he comes down on the issue of the designation of the Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organization. He's criticized that designation, but he has not said that that's a deal breaker. The U.S. position, which is Secretary Blinken laid out once again yesterday, is that if Iran wants to raise matters other than the nuclear deal, fine, the United States will raise matters other than the nuclear deal. I don't think that Mr. Biden is going to change from that perspective. He's under a great deal of political pressure at home, and he's decided that he doesn't want to take additional criticism on this issue. Ordinary Americans can understand the question of the designation of the Revolutionary Guards in a way that they can't necessarily easily grasp some of the details about the nuclear program. And it's very difficult for Mr. Biden to justify removing a terrorist
Patrick,
designation.
if I may interject here now, Joe Biden wants to revive it. President Donald Trump was the one who pulled out from the JCPOA. So tell me, I mean, why is President Biden struggling when it comes to reviving this deal? I mean, he has been in power for more than 2 years now. So tell me, what's stopping him from doing so?
Well, he was very clear as a candidate that he wanted to revive the deal as the first step towards a longer and stronger deal and with follow-on negotiations. And those words will be thrown back at him by his political opponents if he agrees to a deal which is shorter and weaker, and there are no follow-on negotiations. So Biden is in a difficult political position in general, and he doesn't want to add to more criticism of him for not following through on his pledge as a candidate that he would revive the deal only as the first step towards a longer and stronger deal that began negotiations on other issues.
Okay, Sitara, let me come to you. Who is to blame here, in your view? Who is to blame over this failure when it comes to reviving the JCPOA? Is it the U.S.? Is it the politics within the United States, or your country, the politics within your country? Because remember, not long ago, in your country's parliament, there were calls to reinforce the nuclear program.
Yes, the call actually came after Iranian citizens saw that in return for allowing what President Obama at his time called the most rigorous inspection regime on its nuclear facilities, on Iran's nuclear facilities, in return for what was expected to be a removal of all sanctions. But this did not happen, and there was no economic ease that the Iranian citizens could feel in their lives. And there's a lot of, the public opinion in Iran wants Iran to take a stronger stand against U.S. Unilateral withdrawal from the deal. And I should also mention that even though President Biden mentioned that he would want to revive the deal, so far we have not seen any action coming from the U.S. establishment that actually signals any willingness from the establishment to revive the deal. And that's the problem. I mean, we have not seen anything different from Trump's administration with regards to the nuclear deal. Maybe the rhetoric was different, but the actual consequences of Biden's election have not been different. The U.S. has not done anything to show goodwill and that it would be willing to return to the deal and lift the sanctions. I would also say that the European partners, the European signatories of the deal, have also failed to stand to the U.S. When it comes to the deal and their commitments, and that also plays a major role in narrowing the chances of reviving the deal. So the deal could be saved if the European and the U.S., the European signatories and the U.S. wanted to save it. But the problem is, so far, after more than a year, we have not seen anything coming from them that shows that they are actually willing to save the deal.
Okay, so as I understand from what you have just said, the U.S. has failed, the EU has failed, and now, according to the Iranian government, the IAEA has also failed, because recently Iran said in a statement that the IAEA is not an impartial broker. So why Iran is still working with the IAEA?
Because Iran has, during various administrations, even before FM Zarif starts working closely with the European and the U.S., the European signatories and the U.S. Has tried to show its goodwill. We significantly reduced our nuclear activities during while working towards the JCPOA. But we have not, basically, we have not received anything. And we should also remember that the cameras that have been, the surveillance cameras that have been turned off at this point are the ones that Iran had agreed to install as part of the additional protocol. And it was not like the conventional ones that any nations would install on their nuclear facilities. So we are seeing
If I may interject here, Sitare, because
behavior.
that's a very important development, Iran dismantling surveillance cameras at nuclear sites. Tell us, what kind of message do you think Iran is trying to send to the IAEA and much of the West with dismantling these cameras? Is it possible for Iran to completely dismantle all surveillance cameras installed at the nuclear sites in the near future?
I don't think that would happen, but this is just what I think. And based on Iran's cooperation with the International Atomic Agency. And as you know, the agency had previously several times verified the peaceful nature of Iran's nuclear activity, but still Iran agreed to allow surveillance even beyond the normal protocols. So I don't think that would happen, but it is a signal from Iran probably to say that if the International Atomic Agency fails to safeguard its impartiality, Iran can also take steps, which I hope that does not happen, because we want to see that the UN and the International Atomic Agency are still trying to be partly impartial and to cooperate with Iran for what is better for both the Iranian citizens and the
Let me add one more question here. Let's assume for a second Iran dismantles all surveillance cameras at nuclear sites. What's going to happen? Is Iran going to engage in developing nuclear weapons? Is that the case? Is that the view shared among the general public in Iran?
No, not really. I mean, with the fatwa or the verdict that comes from Ayatollah Khamenei and based on the Islamic teachings, developing a nuclear weapon is totally forbidden, even though there are voices in Iran who would say that that's maybe the wiser decision, which I totally disagree. And I don't think that's what Iran would do, but it's just a signal that they would stop cooperating at the scale that they are cooperating at this moment with the International Atomic Agency. Because on the other side, you see that the Zionist regime is not a member of the NPT, and they have nuclear weapons in the region, and they pose a great threat to the nations of the region. But we don't see any punishment or any sanctions or any action that comes from the International Atomic Agency or other international bodies against that regime.
Okay, Borzu, to what extent do you think the internal domestic political dynamics of Iran have played a role in damaging this nuclear deal? I mean, because certainly there are conflicting opinions within Iran as well. Like Sitare just mentioned, there are people who support one thing, then there are people who support an entirely different thing.
I mean, I think there is a domestic dynamic there. It's in some ways quite different than the domestic dynamic in the United States. But for example, the major stumbling block has been, as Patrick mentioned, this whole issue of the Revolutionary Guard. There are some within Iran's elite who regard the sanctioning of the Revolutionary Guard and its designation as a terrorist organization as an empty symbolic gesture, which to some extent it is. But there are others who are demanding that, there are many people. The Revolutionary Guard is a full-blown branch of the Iranian armed forces. There are many veterans. There are many people who were just drafted into the IRGC. And they don't necessarily share the most hardline ideological aspects of it. And they resent being, called members of a terrorist organization. So there is that domestic dynamic as well that makes it very difficult to compromise on that issue. I think the Americans understand that, but they're, as Patrick pointed out, they're also stuck on this issue, this gift that Trump handed the Biden administration. On the other hand, it's not the American people who are going to suffer if the JCPOA completely collapses and Iran is even further isolated. It's the Iranian people. And I think that, there are voices who are saying within the elite, maybe not the most powerful voices, that we are sacrificing the well-being of the Iranian people. Look at the economy, look at the state of infrastructure. You had this horrible building collapse not so long ago. You had a massive train accident. You had another building collapse. The country needs resources. The country needs to be connected to the rest of the world. It needs the technological resources of the West. It needs investment from abroad. And by letting the JCPOA collapse over a matter of pride, you're basically only hurting the people of Iran.
Okay, Patrick, let me come to you now. So if reviving is not an option right now, is replacing still an option? Can it be replaced with another completely new deal?
Probably not. The Biden administration's view is that they took an important unilateral step to establish confidence with Iran by dropping the Trump administration claim that UN sanctions had snapped back. Iran, for that matter the Europeans, completely ignored the US action, paid no attention to it at all. And from that, the Biden team has decided that there's really no point in making further steps towards Iran unless they're part of a negotiated deal. And this deal that we're negotiating now is the only negotiated deal that's on the table. So the Biden team has concluded there's no point in making unilateral gestures to Iran, and that we have to wait until we see what Iran might agree to. Meanwhile, the Biden team is going to continue to say that the IAEA commitments by Iran are very important. The IAEA is a very careful technical agency. It has never said that Iran's program is peaceful. It's always said that Iran has observed its safeguard agreements. Now Iran is backing away from even observing its safeguard agreements. But the agency has never come to what it calls a broader conclusion that Iran's program is peaceful.
Then how President Biden's view on the JCPOA is different from that of President Donald Trump? I want to refer to what Sitare mentioned earlier. The rhetoric coming from the U.S. Is different now under President Joe Biden. But when it comes to concrete actions, they're pretty much the same, aren't they?
No, the United States backed off on its claim that snapback sanctions had come into effect. That was a major part of the Trump administration's campaign of maximum pressure against Iran. And the United States unilaterally changed that. And it got no advantage whatsoever from either Iran or the Europeans for this considerable change in policy, which was criticized here at home. And the Biden team says, well, if we're not going to get anything from Iran, or for that matter from the Europeans, we're taking unilateral steps away from Donald Trump's policies. Why should we do that? We're going to wait until we can negotiate a deal.
Okay, we're in the dying minutes of the program. Sitara, I would like to come to you now. What do you think future holds for Iran's nuclear program in light of the latest developments? Are we likely to see more and more escalation between Iran and the West, or do you still think there is a diplomatic way to end this drama?
I think inside Iran there is still this determination to work on trying to reduce the escalation. But since we don't see much hope coming from the other sides, I would say the escalation of the relations are possible, but still I hope that does not happen.
But Dari, the other side would say there's no hope among them because of the actions that have been perpetrated by Iran. For example, let's take a look at what happened over the past few days. Iran dismantled surveillance cameras at nuclear sites. So certainly, it's understandable the type of concern they have over Iran's nuclear activities.
Well, so far, whatever Iran has done with regard to JCPOA has been a reaction to what the other signatories have done. When the US unilaterally withdrew from the deal, and when the International Atomic Agency failed to safeguard its impartiality, Iran took steps based on the JCPOA and based on protecting its national interests to show that it's also ready to stop cooperating at the scale it is currently cooperating, because at the end of the day, Iran is responsible for protecting its national interests and its citizens.
Thanks all for being with us here today on The Newsmakers, and thank you for watching. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Jafar Hasnan. Goodbye for now.